Right now, picture your own last night. Maybe you scrolled on your phone until your eyes gave out. Maybe the TV was on for background noise while you drifted off. Maybe you woke up at 3 a.m., stared at the ceiling for 20 minutes, and assumed something was wrong with you. Here's the assumption almost everyone carries around without ever questioning it: that once the sun went down for early humans, that was it. Lights out. Nothing happened until morning. Dark equals asleep. Simple as that. The sun sets, the lights, metaphorically, go off. Everyone drops where they stand, like a video game character running out of battery. It's a tidy story. It's also almost entirely made up, a modern assumption projected backward onto people who never actually lived that way. That assumption is almost completely wrong, and the real answer is stranger, warmer, and a lot more social than everyone just passed out. So what actually filled those long dark hours for tens of thousands of years before a single light bulb existed anywhere on Earth? What did people talk about when there was nothing left to do but talk? Did they lie awake the way you do? Did they dream? And if they did anyone care what those dreams meant? Picture a small group settled into a clearing as the light finally drains out of the sky. The hunting and gathering is done for the day. The fire, built up an hour earlier while there was still enough light to gather wood safely, is now the only source of light for miles in any direction. It throws a small circle of orange onto the faces sitting around it, and beyond that circle, everything is simply gone, folded into a darkness so complete that most modern people have never actually experienced it, not once, not even camping. Because somewhere nearby, there's almost always a porch light or a phone screen bleeding into the black.
Someone is turning a piece of meat slowly over the coals. Someone else is working a piece of cord between their fingers, not really paying attention to it, hands busy out of habit while their eyes stay on the fire. An older member of the group shifts a log with a stick, sending up a brief shower of sparks that draws a few tired, appreciative sounds from the smaller kids still awake. Children who fell asleep an hour ago are curled against the nearest adult, occasionally stirring at a louder laugh or the crack of a branch settling in the flames. Somewhere, just past the light, an animal calls out once, distant enough that nobody even glances up, close enough that everybody still, on some quiet, unconscious level, clocked exactly where it came from. Nobody has announced that it's story time. Nobody needs to. Once the practical work of the day is finished, and the fire is the only thing left demanding attention, the conversation itself changes shape, almost without anyone deciding it should. Above all of it, without any artificial light anywhere on the planet to compete with, the night sky isn't a faint smear the way it is over most modern cities. It's overwhelming, a genuinely dense field of stars stretching horizon to horizon, bright enough in places to cast the faintest hint of shadow. Someone leans back and simply looks up for a while, tracing a pattern they've traced 100 times before, half paying attention, half just letting their eyes rest on something other than the fire. Nobody needs a reason. It's just what the sky looks like when nothing artificial is drowning it out. A view so ordinary to them that it likely never occurred to anyone in that circle that it was anything worth remarking on, the same way you'd never comment out loud on the ceiling of your own bedroom. Researchers who have spent time with present-day hunter-gatherer groups, including anthropologist Polly Wiessner's work with the Juhawansi people of the Kalahari, have found something specific about firelit conversation. During the day, talk tends to be practical. Complaints, gossip, negotiations, who owes who what. But once the fire is lit and the sky is dark, the same people shift, almost on cue, toward an entirely different register. Stories about distant relatives, myths about how the world came to be, memories stretched and reshaped with each retelling. Wiessner's recordings, gathered over years of fieldwork and published in 2014, found that story and myth made up a striking share of firelit talk, compared to almost none of it during daylight hours, when conversations stayed firmly rooted in the practical business of the day.
Wiessner herself suggested firelight may do something specific to a group's mood and attention, narrowing focus inward, dampening the small daytime frictions and complaints that dominate conversation when there's still work to argue about, and opening space instead for imagination, humor, and the kind of shared stories that quietly bind a group together across generations. The night, it turns out, has always had its own separate conversation, one daylight never gets to hear. Later, well after the fire has burned down to a bed of quiet orange coals, and most of the group has gone still, someone stirs. Maybe it's the cold, finally creeping past the shrinking fire's reach. Maybe it's nothing at all, just a natural surfacing out of sleep that happens to land somewhere in the deep middle of the night. They don't panic. They don't reach for anything to check the time, because there's nothing to check it with, and no reason to want to. Maybe they add a little wood back onto the coals, more out of habit than urgency. Maybe they lie there a while longer, half listening to the group's breathing, half watching the slow crawl of the moon, before sleep pulls them back under. If a modern person woke up this way, alone, wide awake, 3 a.m, no clock, no phone, they'd almost certainly call it insomnia and reach for something to fix it. Whether an ancient person lying in that exact same moment felt anything like that same anxiety, or simply treated it as an unremarkable, ordinary part of how a night unfolds, is exactly the kind of question modern research on ancient sleep has spent the last 2 decades trying to answer, with 2 very different groups of evidence pointing in 2 very different directions. One drawn from candlelit European diaries, the other from wrist monitors strapped onto people living about as close to that ancestral rhythm as anyone alive today still can.
Here's where it gets genuinely strange, though, and where a popular idea about ancient sleep runs directly into a contradiction nobody expected. For years, one of the most widely repeated claims about pre-modern sleep came from the historian Roger E. Kirch, who spent over 16 years combing through diaries, court records, and medical texts from pre-industrial Europe. What he found was consistent and specific. People described going to bed shortly after dark, waking naturally sometime after midnight for what they called their first sleep, staying awake for an hour or more doing exactly the kind of things you'd expect: quiet chores, prayer, sex, conversation, and then drifting into a second sleep until dawn. Some accounts describe people visiting neighbors in the middle of the night, or a 16th century physician recommending the hour after first sleep as an especially good time for couples to conceive children, on the theory that people do it better once the first stretch of rest had taken the edge off exhaustion. References to first sleep and second sleep turn up in sources going back as far as ancient Rome, where writers use the Latin phrase primus somnus for exactly this idea, and the pattern only really starts vanishing from the written record in the late 17th century, right around the same time cities began installing the first widespread street lighting. Akerch's conclusion was bold. Humans, left alone by artificial light, naturally sleep in 2 segmented chunks, and the single unbroken block of sleep you're trying to get every night is actually the unnatural, historically recent invention, dating back only a few hundred years.
That idea spread everywhere, and it's easy to see why. It's the kind of fact that instantly makes you feel better about waking up at 3 a.m. You're not broken. You're just running on the original human operating system. Except when researchers actually went and measured sleep in modern hunter-gatherer societies, the groups living closest to how humans lived before agriculture and electricity, they found something that didn't match the theory at all. In 2015, sleep researcher Jerome Siegel of UCLA led a team that strapped small wrist monitors onto 94 adults across 3 traditional societies: the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, and the Tsimane of Bolivia, none of whom have electricity, artificial lighting, or climate control.
The devices tracked movement and light exposure around the clock, and Siegel's team ended up with over 1,100 combined nights of real data, gathered the hard way, researchers frequently getting their vehicles stuck in sand or mud just to reach the camps in the first place. Over that data, the pattern that emerged was strikingly consistent across all three groups, despite them living on two different continents, speaking unrelated languages, with no contact with each other whatsoever. And it was not segmented sleep, not even close. These groups slept in one continuous block, waking on average only briefly, if at all, with no historically documented first sleep, wake up, second sleep pattern showing up anywhere in the data. What they did find was almost as interesting as what they didn't. People in all three groups stayed awake for 2.5 to 4 hours after sunset, before finally sleeping, chatting, singing, tending the fire, in exactly the kind of firelit social window described earlier. They tended to fall asleep only once nighttime temperatures had dropped enough to feel comfortable, suggesting cooling air, not darkness itself, was often the real signal telling the body it was time to sleep. A detail that quietly upends the assumption that sunset alone controls when humans naturally get tired. Some researchers on the team even floated the idea that this temperature-driven pattern might connect to the body's own internal thermostat winding down for the night, the same physiological drop in core temperature linked to sleepiness in modern sleep lab studies, just triggered here by the actual outside world instead of a bedroom thermostat. They woke up before sunrise, not after it, greeting the coldest part of the night wide awake rather than curled up asleep through it. And despite the total absence of electric light, none of the three groups showed anything resembling chronic insomnia. In fact, researchers noted that some of these languages don't even have a word for the condition, which is a strange thing to sit with if you've ever spent your own 3 a.m. Googling how to fix it. As one anthropologist working with the Hadza put it, describing what those dark hours are actually used for, it's when you mull over what you did that day, what you saw, what you might want to do tomorrow. A genuinely nice time when people are really talking, sometimes singing and dancing in something close to a nightly party. Not every night was purely about sleep and fireside talk either. On nights with a full or near full moon, there's reasonable evidence, including notched bone and antler artifacts from Ice Age Europe, that some researchers interpret as early lunar tracking tools. That early humans paid close attention to how much usable light the moon actually offered. A landscape lit by a full moon is genuinely navigable, bright enough to move through open terrain without stumbling into every root and rock. And it's a reasonable, evidence-adjacent guess that at least some travel and possibly some hunting of nocturnal or moon-active prey took advantage of exactly those brighter nights, rather than waiting for the next sunrise. The same instinct that makes a modern person walk a little more confidently down a moonlit street than a pitch-black one. None of this was formally scheduled the way a modern calendar schedules things. It's closer to a rhythm the group simply felt, the same way you might notice yourself staying up later on a night with an unusually bright moon without ever consciously deciding to. So, which version is true? Both, in a sense, just describing two different populations, separated by thousands of years, and a completely different relationship with light and darkness, temperature and safety, community and solitude. History is rarely one clean story, and sleep, it turns out, is no exception. Eekirch's segmented sleep was very likely real, well documented in candlelit pre-industrial Europe, where nights were long, cold, and only dimly lit by a single flame that made staying half awake through part of the night unremarkable. But that pattern may say more about a specific slice of more recent human history than about hunter-gatherer humans stretching back tens of thousands of years, whose nights, if the Hadza, San, and Tsimane data is any real guide, more likely looked like one long, socially rich block of sleep, bookended by hours of firelit talk on one end and an early, temperature-triggered waking on the other. Now for the part nobody can actually prove, but that's genuinely worth sitting with anyway. Nobody will ever know exactly what individual conversations sounded like around a specific fire 40,000 years ago, or exactly what images passed through a person's mind in the half-lit hour before real sleep took over. But researchers who study both sleep and ancient social structure have pointed out something reasonable to speculate about. In a small group, sleeping in the open, or in a shallow rock shelter, with real predators genuinely capable of approaching in the dark, it's easy to imagine that full, simultaneous unconsciousness for the entire group, all night, every night, would have been a fairly dangerous habit to develop. We'll never have direct proof of a formal night watch rotation in a group from 50,000 years ago. There's no artifact that records something that quiet and informal. But it's a completely reasonable guess, given what we know about group vigilance in other social primates, and the very real predator pressure early humans lived under, that at least some individuals, older members with lighter sleep, or those simply still awake from the fireside conversation, functioned as an informal, rotating safety net for everyone else, without anyone needing to assign the job formally at all. Picture an older member of the group, the one who always seems to wake at the smallest sound, shifting slightly closer to the fire around the time everyone else finally drifts off, feeding it one more piece of wood not because anyone asked, but because that's simply become their unspoken role over the years. Nobody wrote that job description down. Nobody had to. There's a similar, honest gap around dreams. We know dreaming is an ancient, deeply wired part of human sleep, present in some form across every human culture ever studied, and almost certainly present in Homo sapiens for the entire existence of the species. What we can't know is what any specific ancient person actually dreamed about, or how seriously their group treated those dreams the next morning. But it's a reasonable, evidence-adjacent guess based on how consistently dream interpretation shows up across nearly every documented traditional culture on every inhabited continent, from Australian Aboriginal dreamtime traditions to countless hunter-gatherer and small-scale societies studied by anthropologists. That dreams weren't dismissed as meaningless static the way many modern people treat them. They were very likely discussed, argued over, and folded into the group's understanding of the world, right alongside the myths being told a few feet away by the same dying fire. It's easy to imagine a child waking from a vivid dream about a lion, describing it in a shaky voice to whoever's still awake, and an older member of the group treating that description with genuine, careful attention, rather than brushing it off as just a dream. Precisely because in a world without books or written records, every unusual piece of information, even one manufactured by a sleeping brain, was potentially worth taking seriously. None of this means every single night was warm and communal. Cold nights were miserable regardless of company. Sickness didn't pause for sundown. Predator attacks, while rare, were genuinely possible. And no amount of firelit conversation changed the fact that darkness was, in some very real sense, still dangerous. A crying infant at 2 a.m. was exactly as exhausting for a prehistoric parent as it is for a modern one. Arguably more so, with no formula, no nightlight, and no pediatrician on call. Just a tired parent, a fussy baby, and whatever comfort the rest of the group sleeping nearby could offer. Which, to be fair, may have been more than a modern parent gets, alone in a quiet house at 3 a.m. with nobody else awake to hand the baby to for even 5 minutes. The picture isn't that ancient nights were some kind of peaceful utopia compared to yours. It's that they were full, in a way modern nights, wall to wall with private screens and closed bedroom doors, mostly aren't anymore. A modern person lying awake at 3 a.m. is almost always lying there completely alone, phone glowing, everyone else in the house asleep behind closed doors. A hunter-gatherer waking at the same relative point in the night was, more often than not, waking into a group. Other bodies close by. A fire still faintly glowing. The option, if they wanted it, of simply talking to someone. So the next time you find yourself awake at 3 a.m. staring at a ceiling instead of a fire, you're not malfunctioning, and you're not accidentally reliving some universal ancient sleep pattern either, Because the actual ancient pattern, at least among the groups closest to how your ancestors likely lived, looks a lot more like one long, uninterrupted stretch, bookended by hours of real, out loud, firelit conversation with actual people sitting a few feet away. The real difference isn't that they slept in two mysterious phases and you don't. It's that their entire dark half of the day used to belong to other people, sitting close enough to touch. And yours, for most of history's first 99%, almost never used to belong to a screen. Maybe the fix for a bad night isn't a different sleep schedule at all.
Maybe it's just someone else in the room, still awake, the way it almost always used to be.
If you like this one, there's a whole channel of these ancient puzzles waiting for you. The strange, overlooked corners of prehistoric life nobody quite thinks to ask about. New videos come out regularly, so hit subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one.